In this lecture, I'm going to start talking about the various models that we have that try to explain why people develop psychological disorders. Now, the overarching combination model that we're going to get to is the model that incorporates biology, psychology, and social aspects of behavior, and that's known as the biopsychosocial approach. Now, as I mentioned, that contains three different approaches. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about each one more specifically. In this lecture, I'm going to be talking about the biological causes of abnormality. And then in the future videos, you'll see psychological and social causes of abnormality. The biopsychosocial approach basically says that it's all of these different influences on people that actually bring about or can explain abnormal behavior or psychological disorders. So it's not just one particular approach, it's the combination, kind of almost a global view of humanity that really helps us to explain why people develop different disorders. And once we know or can understand why disorders develop, this is also where treatments come from. So all of these methods come with specific treatments from these approaches. So right now we're going to talk about biological causes of abnormality, and specifically brain dysfunction. So when something is going wrong in the structure of the brain, or if there's a brain tumor, if something's not going right in the brain, then we're going to talk about biochemical imbalances, and that's the actual chemicals, neurotransmitters in the brain. It's looking at the balance of the chemistry of what's going on in the brain. And then we're going to look at genetics, and that sometimes the reason people develop disorders is that it has to do with genetic abnormalities or what kinds of things we inherit from our parents. So let's look at the brain organization. And I'm hoping that this is a review for you because you've seen this in other classes or been exposed to the basic brain parts and what our brain is made of. So this image really points to the variety of different parts of the brain that we have, and at different levels of parts of the brain. So one thing to remember is that as we are looking at parts of the brain deepest in the brain, those are going to be related to functions that are the most primitive, the most basic functions needed for life function. So the brain is divided into three main regions. It's divided into forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. So hindbrain is going to be the most deep structures. It's going to be made up of the medulla, the pons, the reticular formation, and the cerebellum. And as I mentioned with the hindbrain, it's the most primitive set of functions. So this is where our blood pressure, our breathing, our heart rate, our ability to wake up or fall asleep, that's where those kinds of things are going to be regulated. Now, if we move forward to the kind of next level of the brain, that's going to get us to the midbrain. And the midbrain is including the superior and inferior collecticus. It's going to include the substantia nigra. So here we're going to have a bit more higher level functions. It's also going to include production of, for example, substantia nigra is going to produce dopamine, which is a really important neurotransmitter. The midbrain is really important still to some of the basic functions that we have. And as we move kind of from the hindbrain to the midbrain, then to the forebrain, which is kind of some of the outermost portions of the brain, we're going to get to the thalamus, hypothalamus, pituitary gland, the limbic system, the cerebellum, and quite a few of these different parts are going to come up as we talk about a variety of different disorders. So if we look a little bit closer at the forebrain specifically, here we have all the blue that's out here. That's the forebrain. So if you were to open a skull and kind of look in, You would see the gyra. That's the cerebral cortex. That's this outer layer of the brain. And we're going to get to that in just a minute. But that's going to be where a whole lot of really complex activities are happening. Now, underneath it, we're still going to have the thalamus, which is the dispatcher or the relay center for a variety of different signals. Every time I think about the thalamus, what I tend to think about is those old-timey telephone dispatchers. If you've seen movies about kind of like early telephone systems, like you would pick up the phone and there would be a dispatcher on another line. You tell them who you want to call. They like connect the different connectors, and then the signal is able to go. That's kind of how I think about the thalamus. The thalamus is going to be the dispatcher. Signals are coming in as you're sensing what's around you. The thalamus says, oh, that needs to go here and that needs to go there. And it's sending those signals to where they're going to be most processed. The hypothalamus is the part of our brain that's going to be most related to a lot of our biological needs. So hunger, thirst, temperature control. But it's also a part of our brain that's responsible for our reaction to stress and marshaling resources and getting us ready for that fight or flight mode. So when we talk about anxiety disorders, when we talk about post-traumatic stress disorders, we're actually going to see the hypothalamus play a really big role, because in those disorders, we are assessing risk where risk does not exist. So our body is an alert, our brain is an alert, but it's not a dangerous situation. And so the system that actually helps us survive and avoid risk is malfunctioning in those particular disorders. So the pituitary gland that's here, and it's like right underneath the hypothalamus. The pituitary gland is the connector between the central nervous system, the brain, and the endocrine system, which is responsible for a variety of glands and production of a variety of hormones. So and I'm going to talk about the endocrine system in a minute. So the brain sends a signal to the pituitary gland, which then sends a signal to a variety of relevant glands. They're going to start producing hormones. So when you think about stress response, we have stress hormones. You think about sex response. There's some sexual hormones that are going on, both that tell our body how to develop and grow, and ones that, turn us on or turn us off. So that's kind of the combination of the brain working right alongside with the endocrine system. We have, as I mentioned, the hindbrain is really deep within. We're talking about balance. We're talking about being able to wake up or not. So if we damage your pons, you won't be able to wake up. We're talking about reticular formation. That's related to, again, to being woken up or asleep, being able to pay attention, looking at conscious functions, various things like that. And finally in there, and it's a little bit hard to see, but the brain is made up of two hemispheres, and in between them, there are fibers that connect them. The two hemispheres aren't connected anywhere except in these fibers. And those fibers specifically are the corpus callosum. And so it's what passing the information back and forth and allowing the two hemispheres to communicate. It is why you and I don't necessarily think about like, oh, that's my left brain and right brain functioning like it just works seamlessly. It's because the corpus callosum is able to do that for us. Now, when people start having problems, is if, for example, some brain parts aren't doing what they're supposed to, or there's damage or a tumor or something that exists in the variety of brain parts. Now, I said we're going to come back to the cerebral cortex, and that's what we're doing next. So the cerebral cortex is that outer layer of the brain, and it is where the most complex, most human-like activities are really going to be handled. It consists of two hemispheres, as I mentioned, so two different halves, and each of the hemispheres is divided into 4 lobes. So there is a frontal lobe in both hemispheres, there is a temporal lobe in both hemispheres, and so on and so forth. So the frontal lobe is right over here. That's right in front. So if you were to look right behind your forehead, that's going to be your frontal lobe. Then as we move a little bit further, the parietal lobe is kind of right at the top of your head. It's right behind the frontal lobe. Then we have the occipital lobe right in the back. And we have the temporal lobe right behind the temples. So out of the four lobes, the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe have names that really tell us where they're located based on the name. So if you're looking to remember these, we want to, you can think of them. The two of them already tell you where they are, and then parietal lobe and then occipital lobe are ones that you should really know. And right in this particular image on the bottom here, we could see the cerebellum, we can see the pons, we can see the stem, and then the medulla. That's part of the hindbrain. So the cerebral cortex is going to lay on top, and then the cerebellum is going to be right back there. So if we look a little closer at the cerebral cortex and at the division. So here we see the different hemispheres, and right in here, that tissue that you see, that's the corpus callosum. That's what I was mentioning, is the connection between the two hemispheres. And we have the temporal lobe kind of looking from the other side. And one of the things that we tend to see here is what's known as the motor cortex and the sensory cortex. Here's the motor cortex and kind of the side view, and then the sensory cortex. And what that means is that there are a bunch of neurons there that are specifically directed at controlling motor function. And there are neurons in the sensory cortex that are specifically directed at control of the sensory functions. And those neurons are not necessarily divided equally across our body. So there's not this, it's not proportional to what our body looks like. What it is actually proportional to how much sensation or how much control we tend to have in various parts of our bodies. So if you think about, we have a lot of control of motion, a very fine motion in our hands. That's why we're able to do lots of very fine motor skills and fine motor tasks. So there are a lot of neurons in the motor cortex that is devoted specifically to control of our hands. Same thing for our tongue, because as you hear me speak, my tongue is doing a lot of different, very minute motions to be able to help me produce the sounds that I'm producing. So there's a lot of motion that's detected there. The same kind of idea for sensory cortex. There are parts of our body that are much more sensitive than others. So when you think about the genitals, you think about how much sensation we can have in our hands, in our lips, those kinds of body parts, they have a whole lot more neurons devoted to them than if you think about like how much control you can have with your legs, or how much control you can have or sensation you can have on the heel of your foot, and things like that. So we have a bunch of different parts. Now, in the left hemisphere of the brain, we have what's known as the auditory cortex, which is where we can hear information here. Language centers are centered in the left hemisphere of the brain. So we have a center for understanding language. We have a center for picking up language. So understanding language, producing language. So those are kind of separate parts of the brain that communicate with one another and are thus allowing us to produce speech. So again, if we look at the limbic system is a set of really important structures, and these regulate many instinctive kinds of behaviors, things like reaction to stressful events, eating. They are located around the central core of the brain, and they're closely interconnected with the hypothalamus. So that's the hypothalamus right there. We have the hippocampus that's right here. The hippocampus is involved in short-term memory. And the reason it's named the hippocampus, and I don't know, I've never been able to see it, but it's because the word hippocampus means seahorse, and whoever named it first thought that it looked like a seahorse. On the end right here, this little kind of round almond shape part of the brain is the amygdala. And amygdala is a structure that's really critical to our understanding and experience of emotion, and especially emotions like fear and stress response and things like that. So here we really kind of getting into those types of reactions that we're going to see in some of the psychological disorders. Now, I mentioned that the central nervous system communicates with the endocrine system, our hormone system. So we could look a little closer here, right? This little piece of tissue right there, that's the pituitary gland. So it's right underneath the hypothalamus, and it's sitting right there, and it is the master gland of the endocrine system. And the endocrine system is a bunch of glands that produce different hormones that help us function. They affect our mood, our energy, our reaction to stress, sexual functioning, sexual development. All of these different things are involved. The pituitary gland, as I mentioned, is the master gland. It's controlling other glands. So we have the hypothalamus, which is part of the central nervous system, and right underneath it is the pituitary gland. Then what we also have is the thyroid and parathyroid gland, the pancreas, the adrenal glands. Adrenal glands, for example, are related to stress response. We have ovaries in women and testes in men. These are related to sexual development and sexual functioning. So we're going to see that pituitary gland is going to direct all these other glands in either producing more or less of their respective hormones, and that helps regulate all kinds of body functions. And it's connected to the hypothalamus. Now, one of the kind of functions, especially that's related to stress, is what's known as the HPA axis. H stands for the hypothalamus, P is the pituitary gland, and A is the adrenal glands. And then the adrenal glands are releasing stress hormones. So in a stress reaction, in a fight or flight kind of reaction, an anxiety reaction, what we're having is the hypothalamus saying this is a dangerous situation. The pituitary gland says, all right, I'm going to get this ball rolling. It tells the adrenal glands to produce stress hormones, specifically cortisol. As cortisol levels rise, that will eventually signal the hypothalamus that, like, hey, there's a lot of stress hormones going on here. Maybe you should tamp down the alarm because we already have a lot of stress hormones. The hypothalamus kind of calms down, which then causes the pituitary gland to calm down, which then causes less stress hormones. And when the levels are too low, it kind of turns back on. So it's a self-regulating system. And it tends to work pretty well under most circumstances. Now, sometimes, though, it goes wrong. And that's when we're going to start having some of the anxiety and trauma-related kinds of disorders. So when we talk about PTSD, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder, this is a disorder in which the stress response system is overactive. And the body and the brain is having a normal reaction to an extreme stressor, except that doesn't stop once the stressor is done. And so that's the place where it becomes abnormal. So we're going to get to all of that when we talk about those specific disorders. Now let's look a little bit closer and a little more minute parts of the central nervous system. And specifically, let's look at the building blocks of it. And that's the specific cells called neurons in the central nervous system. So here's what we have. And we have, this is a neuron. This is what a neuron looks like. And a neuron consists of 4 major parts. It has the cell body, which is right over here. And the cell body is responsible for maintenance of the cell, making sure it's functioning properly. It's not really involved in the signaling that happens within neurons. Now, the next part are the dendrites, and that's these little branches that are specifically off of the cell body. So what we want to think about a neuron is a one-way street. Signal is going to come this way. It's going to be picked up by the dendrites. The word dendrite comes from a Greek word meaning the root of a tree. And that's how the dendrites work. So if you think about what roots of a tree do, is they spread out and they look for nutrients, and then they bring those into the tree. Now, the same kind of thing is going to happen with dendrites. They're spread out and they're picking up signals from other neurons, and they're bringing those signals in. So the signal is going to be brought in by the dendrites, and it's going to then travel down the axon, which is this long tail, and it's eventually going to get down to what are known as terminal buttons. Terminal buttons are right back here. So the axon is going to end on a bunch of branches as well. And at the end of each branch is going to be kind of a place that's called a terminal button. Once there, that's where we have neurotransmitters stored there. That's where a lot of the actual signaling and communication is going to happen. Now, the nerve impulse, when we talk about that, is a actual signal. It's a change in the charge of this neuron, and it will move down this axon, and it will get to the end of these terminal buttons, and that's how we're going to see signaling happen. So it's an electrochemical reaction, meaning that there are chemicals that are moving about, which is causing a difference in the charge to momentarily form. And it's kind of like a domino effect. It starts and then kind of goes all the way down. And the synapse is actually the gap between the end of one neuron, so the terminal buttons of one neuron, and then the dendrites, the beginning of the next neuron. And neurons do not connect. They don't touch. They actually come very close, but they don't touch. And so they sit close to one another. And it's really in that gap that communication is going to happen. That's where neurotransmitters and various drugs that we take are going to start having their effects, is in that gap. And so the synapse, or the synaptic gap, as it's sometimes called, is where we're going to see some important things happen. So I'm going to zoom in so the next picture is going to show you kind of the end, the terminal buttons of one, and then the beginning or the dendrite of another. So that's what this image is. So this is the terminal button of one neuron, and then this is the dendrite, the beginning of the next. This right here is the synaptic space, or the synaptic gap. These are called the synaptic vesicles, and then there's mitochondria in there that kind of help power the cells. So what's going to happen is that here's where neurotransmitters are going to come into play. And neurotransmitters are chemical messengers. They are biochemicals, and they act as messengers carrying various impulses from one neuron or one nerve cell to another. And they're going to cross that synaptic gap and look for a place to fit on the adjacent neuron. So what we have is neurotransmitters can either be inhibitory, so they tell the next neuron, stop firing, or they can be excitatory. They tell the next neuron, hey, it's time to wake up, let's fire. So they can be inhibitory or excitatory. And the postsynaptic neuron, that's the neuron after the synapse. So the synapse is the gap. So this next neuron is one, so on the dendrites, there are receptor sites. There are specific places where the neurotransmitter is going to travel and fit. So there are specific receptor sites for specific neurotransmitters. And in order for a neurotransmitter to be able to influence or impact the next neuron, it has to have a receptor site for it. And so the other important process that is here is what's known as reuptake. So this is a really efficient system. One neurotransmitter is going to one neuron, is going to send out neurotransmitters into the synaptic gap. Those neurotransmitters are going to travel looking for receptor sites. Once they find them, they're going to stimulate this next neurotransmitter. But there might be this next neuron. There might be a bunch of extra neurotransmitters floating about in the synaptic space. And so what happens is the presynaptic neuron, the sending neuron, is going to suck them back up and take them back up. And that process is called the reuptake process. So it's the reabsorption of excess by the presynaptic neuron. It's the sending neuron that's going to suck back up the neurotransmitters that weren't used, they're going to sit there and wait for the next time that the electrochemical impulse comes and tells them to go out into that space and look for receptor sites. Now, sometimes there's still rogue neurotransmitters left in that synapse space, and there are a variety of enzymes that are going to come in and destroy kind of the leftovers to clear the space. So we have degradation, which is what I was talking about, which is the postsynaptic neuron releases an enzyme. It gets rid of all the leftover neurotransmitters in that space, and then we're ready to go for the next reaction. Now, there are a bunch of different neurotransmitters, and some of the ones that are really important that we're going to hear a lot about are serotonin. So serotonin is responsible for memory. It's responsible for depression, anxiety, aggressive impulses. So if you've heard of drugs like SSRIs, for example, so these are Paxil, Prozac, Lexapro, those kinds of drugs, those drugs are in a class called SSRI. So what that stands for is selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So what that means is those drugs are taken by people for whom their serotonin system is underactive. Either they're not producing enough of that serotonin or something else is happening there. And so when they take those drugs stop this reuptake process. So this neuron is trying to suck back in all the leftover neurotransmitters from the synapse, but what the drug is going to do is going to come in here and block it. So it can't suck back in. So there's still neurotransmitters left in the system, and they're still able to look for receptor sites and continue to have an effect on the next neuron, even though this one is ready for them to be done. So what that does is it helps to increase the amount of a neurotransmitter in the synapse and hopefully have an impact on whatever that neurotransmitter does. So for drugs that are SSRIs, it will increase the amount of serotonin that's available to stimulate the next neuron. And that helps people who have anxiety and depression and conditions like that. But we all use serotonin all the time to help us with our mood, to help us with sleep, appetite, anxiety, aggression, things like that. Dopamine is a really, really useful neurotransmitter. It's most known for pleasure. So it's most known for, this is the thing that makes you feel good. But it's actually so much more than that. It is important for motivation. It is important for memory. It is important for learning. It is important for pleasure. Specifically, it's actually what makes drugs addictive. It's why people want to have sex, is because dopamine is released. It's related to reinforcement and rewards, which is quite important in how we learn. So dopamine is a super important neurotransmitter. The next one is norepinephrine, which is related to kind of a stress response. It's kind of what gets us going, is what is an activating kind of neurotransmitter. It's what's released in times of stress and stressful reactions. And so when people take drugs like cocaine or amphetamines, it tends to prolong the norepinephrine effect. But cocaine and amphetamines also mimic dopamine. And so what it's going to do is create a high and lots of energy and kind of a go, go, go kind of situation that we see people who are high on those drugs have. Dopamine is an interesting neurotransmitter because when we have too little dopamine, so dopamine is related also to muscular function. So when we don't have enough dopamine, we tend to see shakiness, muscle stiffness, difficulty with movement, basically the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. People who have Parkinson's disease have low active or like inactive systems of dopamine. And so the drug, for example, that's used to treat Parkinson's symptoms is called L-DOPA, DOPA relating to dopamine. So when we will talk about dopamine, it's implicated also. High levels of dopamine are related to schizophrenia. And so when we talk about schizophrenia, when people use antipsychotic medications, those lower dopamine, and sometimes they have to lower dopamine quite significantly to reduce the symptoms, and people start having side effects of those drugs that look very much like Parkinson's disease, where people will be shaky or have twitches and kind of have a shuffling walk. So it's kind of a drug created almost Parkinson reaction. So finally, the last neurotransmitter I'm going to talk right now about is what's known as gamma aminobutyric acid. GABA is what almost everybody calls it. And GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and it is responsible for us feeling relaxed. So when you're feeling relaxed, calm, and kind of nothing is bothering you, that's because there's GABA around in your system. So people who are particularly anxious or stressed out have very little GABA activity going on. So drugs like Xanax, for example, or Klonopin tend to increase or mimic GABA, which creates this really quick, relaxing, active feeling that people tend to have. They inhibit the stress reaction by releasing GABA into the system. So when we look at people and we look at their makeup, people can have problems or psychological problems because of the structure of the brain, because there's damage or kind of some problematic, something developed either from birth, or it might be because of a tumor or a stroke. There's some damage to the structure of the brain. That can be one thing that causes a psychological disorder. People can have psychological disorders because of biochemical imbalances, and that's an imbalance in one of these different neurotransmitters. There are can be too many, or there can be too few receptors for a variety of neurotransmitters. Sometimes it might be that the amount of the neurotransmitter is there, but there's not enough receptors. Or maybe the receptors are there, but they're not sensitive enough to pick up the stimulation that comes from the neurotransmitters. So there's some malfunction or an imbalance in the neurotransmitters. That's the second possible cause of different kinds of psychological disorders. So the third cause, what can bring about either some of these brain malformations or different imbalances or something else, is genetics. And what we're talking about here is a field of behavior genetics, which is the study of the genetics of personality and abnormality. And this is a field that's concerned specifically with questions like, to what extent of behaviors or behavioral tendencies are inherited? What are the processes by which the genes affect our behavior? So people who study these really are going to look at chromosomes, they're going to look at DNA, they're going to look at specific genes, they're going to look at family and kind of characteristics that seem to travel through the family. So all of those different things. What we're really looking at are genotype, which is what is the specific DNA, the genetic code that you have inherited. But not everything that we inherit in our DNA is actually expressed. So sometimes we might be carriers for certain features, but it's not something that is expressed. So I might be a carrier for blue eyes, but my eyes are brown. So my genotype is blue eyes and brown eyes, but my phenotype is what is expressed, what is observable. So this is how sometimes people can have genes for certain features or for certain conditions, but they don't experience them themselves. That means that they have the genotype, but not the phenotype form. So phenotype is what's expressed. Genotype is what's the code that's present. So when we look at genetic influences and kind of what kinds of influences and which disorders have a genetic influence and which disorders don't, there's a variety of different methods that's studied. One of the ways to study this is through what's known as a family method. And really what we're going to look at is we're going to start with what's known as the index or the proband case, and that is the person with a diagnosis. So if we look at here, we're going to have that's the person with a diagnosis. And then we're going to start looking at first degree relatives. So these are children. And then we're going to look at second degree relatives, grandchildren, cousins, so on and so forth. So if a disorder is genetic, if it is passed on through genes, what we would expect is in this first level of relatives is that we're going to have a whole lot more cases than in the second level, because first degree relatives share more DNA than second degree relatives and then third degree relatives. So you have 50% of your DNA that comes from your mom and your dad. So you share 50% of your DNA with those two. Now you share about 25% of your DNA with your grandparents. So it would make sense that the further out we go, the less we're going to see. The closer we are to this kind of this index case, this proband, who we're comparing to, the more cases we're going to see. If we see this pattern, then what that means is that this disorder is in fact genetic. If we don't see this pattern, it means it's not passed down through genetics. And as we go on and I talk about the various disorders, you'll hear me say this disorder appears to be genetic, or this is the percent of risk genetically. Some of that comes from this study of family method. Now, another way to study the genetic influences is to look at twins. And twins are really, interesting in a lot of different ways. So we have two different types of twins. We have what are known as monozygotic twins, and these are identical twins. And really, if you look, mono meaning one, so they came from one zygote. So an egg and a sperm merge, they form a zygote. That, in most cases, forms one baby. But sometimes it splits into two and then forms two babies, or three, or however many. So that's monozygotic. They came from exact same genetic material. Monozygotic twins share 100% of their DNA. They also share 100% of their environment. They are in utero together and they grow up together. So they share all of their environmental influences. Dizygotic twins, so di meaning two, they came from two zygotes. So there were two eggs and two sperm that fertilize at the same time, and then you have these two babies growing. This is basically like any other sibling. So they share 50% of their DNA, and what's not like every other sibling is that these siblings share 100% of their environment. So if you think about it, so I have a brother. My brother is 4 years younger than I am. He and I had different experiences when we were in our mother's uterus. He and I have also had different life experiences. I am 4 years older, meaning that I had 4 years of life as an only child. He had that also, but at a different stage in his life. So when he was 14, I went off to college, so he had those 4 years as kind of a pseudo only child. But we had different life experiences. Dizygotic twins are in utero together, they're born together, and they grow up together in the same way. So they share 100% of their environment, and they're related to one another just like every other sibling. So we can see, so if a disorder is in fact genetic, we should see a whole lot more matching between identical twins than fraternal twins. And in fact, what that's called concordance. So concordance is when we are diagnostically similar. If one has a disorder, so does the other, means that they are concordant. One has a disorder, the other one doesn't, they are not concordant. So if a disorder is only genetic, then if one twin has it, the other one should have 100% likelihood of having that disorder as well. If we look at dizygotic twins, if a disorder is genetic, if one has it, the other one should have about a half likelihood of having it because they only share 50% of their DNA. Now, what that does is when we look at those numbers is the equal environment assumption. And that's only possible in twins because twins are the only kinds of humans that have 100% of their in utero and post-birth environment that is shared. There are no other siblings that are like that. Now, the other thing we're going to look at as I'm talking about environment a lot is we're going to look at adoptees. So let's look and see what happens to babies that are adopted and raised by different kinds of families. And the big question here is, are adopted children similar to biological parents? So are they similar to people who share their DNA? Or are they similar to people who raised them? So what looking at adoptee studies is really answering the question of nature versus nurture. So is it your genes that are determining what kind of characteristics you have, what disorders you have, or is it how you're raised? And so if there is in fact a genetic predisposition for something, then what we would expect is that if you were raised by adoptive parents, but you're much more like your biological parents. So if your adoptive parents have no mental illness, but your biological parents had schizophrenia, and you are raised by these healthy parents, and you still develop schizophrenia, that is evidence of biological predisposition, genetic predisposition, because you're more like the biological parents than you are the parents who raised you. So that's kind of how that works. So when we look at some studies and how studies look at these different disorders, here is some data on twin concordance rates. So the blue is dizygotic. So these are fraternal twins. The yellow is the monozygotic. So these are identical twins. And here we're looking at anxiety disorders. Look at how significantly those are related, but much less so, much less genetic concordance for fraternal twins. Look at the alcohol abuse. So about half as likely for fraternal twins than for identical twins. And so we can see across the board, if you share 100% of your DNA, you are much more likely to have a disorder that your 100% same DNA sibling does. But notice that for all of these, it doesn't go up to 100. So no disorder is 100% just genetic. All of them are influenced by the environment. So if we look at some family study data, so this is looking at family studies. So this is risk for a disorder. Blue is if one parent has it, and yellow is compared to the rest of the population. So if we look at some of these, you notice that for these different ones that are presented here, if you have a parent with that particular disorder, it means that you are much more likely to have that disorder as well. Look, alcohol abuse, for example, and this is for men. If you have one parent who is an alcoholic, you have a 27% likelihood of also becoming an alcoholic for that child. But in general population, the lifetime risk for alcoholism is 5%. So you are 5 times more likely to develop this problem than anybody in the general population. But notice you share 50% of your DNA with that parent, but your likelihood of having the same disorder is not 50%. So even here, we see a really significant risk. It's not all genes, that there is something else playing in there. And what this brings me to is what's known as the diathesis stress model, which is quite important and how tries to explain how do genetics and other factors play together. So this diathesis stress model incorporates 2 factors. The diathesis, which is your predisposition. So this is kind of what's your genetic material that you have. And then stress is some sort of difficult experience. This can be daily life stressors, or it can be a traumatic experience. It could be childhood abuse, or it can be living in poverty. It can be lots of different kinds of things. Poor nutrition, all of those kinds of things. So we have the genetic predisposition, and then we have stress. And what this model says is that stress and predisposition interact together and explain and how some people develop a disorder and others don't. So this is kind of what it looks like. So if you have a low predisposition for a disorder and low amount of stress, you don't have a disorder. You might have some genetic code, but no disorder. Even if you have a high predisposition for disorder, but very, very low exposure to stress, you're still not going to show a disorder. But let's imagine you have moderate predisposition and you grow up in a really stressful environment. You're going to show that disorder. So this kind of model helps explain why some people who come from very similar backgrounds, very similar genetic predispositions, their parents had similar conditions, why some people, one develops a disorder and one doesn't. Because what this is saying is environment is important. So what the diathesis model says is it's not nature versus nurture, it's nature and nurture. It's what you have as your biological building material and what kinds of things you experience in your life. Those two things are going to meet, and that interaction of the two is actually what's going to determine whether or not your genotype becomes your phenotype, whether or not what you're predisposed to having actually becomes something that we see, whether that disorder code that you have in your DNA becomes an actual disorder that you experience. So that's kind of how we look at the biology. And what this is known as, we have the polygenic process here, which is that we have multiple genetic abnormalities that come together in one individual and create a specific disorder. So it can be one predisposition or it can be multiple different processes. And for most disorders that we have, we don't have just one thing that kind of says if you have this one gene, then you are going to have a disorder. It's usually a bunch of different kinds of predispositions that all put together are what are going to possibly make it likely that you have a disorder. So it's a polygenetic process. And we also have what's known as epigenetics, which is the environmental conditions that affect the expression of genes. That's the field that really looks at and studies this. And it's the environment that instructs our genes to either turn on or turn off. And so all of these different processes are part of this diathesis stress model. And when we look at all these biological ideas and all these different processes, this is where we're going to get a variety of biological therapies. So we're going to talk about drugs. We're going to talk about drugs like Paxil, Prozac, antipsychotics, a variety of different drugs that might influence psychological conditions and also sometimes produce side effects. But it is a treatment that comes from the biological therapy. Now, these drugs, for the most part, for psychological disorders, don't actually treat or get rid of the underlying cause of the disorder. They mainly just treat the symptoms. So generally, quite often, if someone stops taking the drug, the symptoms do come back. Now, we have a bunch of new, mostly new, techniques that have been developed, known as brain stimulation techniques, that have been used to help people treat a variety of different psychological conditions. So an old treatment is electroconvulsive therapy. And what this is we're going to have different electrodes placed in the brain. It's an electrical stimulus that is passed through the brain. It causes a grand mal seizure, and something about that seizure actually helps people with very severe depression. It usually requires several iterations of the treatment, but it seems to be effective. Now, it has a side effect of memory loss. So most often it's temporary, but sometimes it's not. And so it's not used. It's not a first kind of line of defense. Plus, ECT also has kind of a shady past to it. It's been applied in all kinds of different situations. When people tend to think about ECT, they think of someone like biting down on a stick and shaking violently. It's not actually what it looks like today. You should, I will post for you a video of, it's an older video even, but it still shows what that looks like. There's muscle relaxants and all kinds of different medications that are used to help people with reaction, but it is something that is currently used. It is available, but it is generally used for very severe cases of depression. Another newer, more modern treatment is what's known as repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, or quite often it's just referred to as TMS. And this is done in a psychiatrist's office. It's several iterations. You kind of sit in a machine that directs magnetic stimulation kind of through your brain to try to stimulate certain parts of your brain that way. It's several treatments. People generally tend to report maybe some headaches as a side effect, but it's showing some really promising results. It's still quite new, so it's a little bit long-term data is not known yet, but it is quite promising, and it's not invasive. Like there's no cutting, there's no like putting you under or anything like that that's involved. So that's also what makes it attractive. There is deep brain stimulation and vagus nerve stimulation, and both of these look kind of similar. So this image right over here is pointing to a vagus nerve stimulation kind of treatment. So there is a pulse generator that's implanted right underneath the collarbone. It has kind of a wire that's attached to an electrode, and this electrode is going to be stimulating the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is going to travel all the way down, and we have kind of on both sides of the body, and it's been shown to have some quite interesting effects. Deep brain stimulation is going to have electrodes that are inserted into the deep portions of our brain, specifically kind of where some of the brain centers for various functions for specific disorders are related. And that is going to stimulate there. And so what we see here then is it's a invasive set of procedures because there are implants and things like that. The kind of pulse that the pulse generator produces can be changed or controlled by a kind of a remote control type device that the psychiatrist might have, so they can increase or decrease the pulse. But it's been showing some interesting results in helping people with a variety of problems like depression and OCD and various things like that. But again, it's much more invasive, it's more expensive, there are some side effects than some of the other kind of treatments that we have. And then the other treatments that come from the biological therapies include psychosurgery. So this is a variety of surgeries, whether to remove tumors or kind of correct some sort of structural abnormality. So that's where, as we talk about different disorders, I'm going to be mentioning different kinds of treatments, and this is where they're coming from. And this is just kind of a preview of some of the possibilities that we're going to see. So assessing or evaluating biological approaches, there are side effects to a lot of these therapies. So that's a kind of a bummer. They do treat the symptoms, sometimes quite effectively, but they don't treat necessarily underlying condition. And so if you stop the medication, for example, then the symptoms come back. And so that's the downside. So quite often people will have to be on these medications for quite a long period of time. And one of the biggest criticisms of just the biological approach is that it is reductionist. It ignores the environment, it ignores psychological functioning, ignores culture and all kinds of different things, that it is maybe too simplistic in its approach. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not simple at all. It's actually highly complicated, and we're still learning. There's still a lot we don't know. But just looking at your biology is too simplistic. The humans have a whole lot more that's influencing their behavior. And so just looking at someone's biology is not enough. So that's why we're going to be talking about people and disorders from a biopsychosocial perspective. Biology is absolutely important, and it's part of everything, but it is interacting with the psychological and the social influences that people face. And that's what more fully helps explain how disorders come to be. And that's also going to provide us with more full treatments for these different disorders. So the next video that I'm going to have for you is focusing on some of those other approaches in this biopsychosocial model.